Yes, good morning. It's Wednesday, the 22nd of July, 2020. Welcome back to the best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. My name's Pete Fairbairn and I'm joined by one of Australia's top journos every weekday to talk through 5 of the biggest stories happening in the world of sport. Beth Newman's with me today. How are you, Beth?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Pete.
My absolute pleasure. Thanks for getting up early and reading the papers and coming up with the big stories to talk through for our watchers and listeners today. We're going to start where you are in Sydney in the AFL. Sydney Swans coach John Longmire has joined the call for an extended bench, as reported by a friend of the show, Vince Rigari, in the Sydney Morning Herald. For those not following this one closely, essentially with 4 rounds of football being squeezed into 3 weeks in the AFL, Longmire has lent his voice to calls for the AFL to consider extending the number of players on the interchange bench to help offset the physical toll of a condensed fixture over coming weeks. The Swans, of course, absolute injury crisis for them at the moment. We do have shortened AFL quarters this season, but there are a lot of respected voices within the industry calling for the number of players to be increased from 4 to 6. Is this a fair point Longmire makes, or does the shortened quarters prepare the players for the 4 and 5 day turnarounds?
Yeah, I think in any other situation, I would probably say, you know what the schedule is, you've got to prepare for it, and injuries happen, and that's kind of part of footy. But I think probably the unique thing that's happening at the moment is the fact that, teams are having to be away from home, not able to bring people into squads as easily as they normally are, particularly Victorian teams. And so the ability to actually just replace and churn and, pull guys up from reserve grade and all of those sorts of things that teams normally rely on are not at their disposal. So I think you do have to be a lot more careful about how you manage players, and maybe the answer to that is a bit of an extended bench. So if someone does, ping a hammy or feel a bit of soreness during a game, you can manage them carefully and limit their game time so that you're not having to rush injured players back. I think, that was the example. I think Tom McCartan was the one that John Longmire used, and you don't want to be having to rush guys back from injuries and having to play them more minutes than they should, because then, players who are already in a pretty tough situation are having to put their physical health at risk, just to get a few games of footy done in a short space of time. And, the shortened quarters, as you said, are an important element, but, in terms of injury management and that sort of thing, like, you can't account for that, and halving effectively the gaps between games, to down to 4-day breaks for some teams. You just need to be able to have the opportunity to make sure that players can be eased back from injuries, or else, you're going to have issues, and you're going to end up with somebody in a really bad situation, or a team that really is battling, and it's not going to be good for anybody.
Yeah, really, really well said, Beth. And for those playing along at home, you'll see I lifted the golden strainer. That's how we keep our topics short and sharp. And my friend on the line knows how that it's time to wrap up so we can move on to the next one. But I will just add on this one. I thought a really interesting suggestion came from Western Bulldogs Premiership coach Luke Beveridge, who said that you could have an extra 2 players available on the bench only to be activated in the instance of an injury. And if a player was subbed off injured, in order to stop any rorts of that system, that player would be ineligible to play in the next match, which I thought was a really interesting take. Our second story today is from The Australian. It stays a little bit in the AFL, but also crosses over to the NRL. And it's a great piece by Jessica Halloran. She's got an interview with AFL Premiership coach Paul Roos, talking about the way football coaches in different codes are being hung out to dry in the pandemic era. We've seen 3 coaches sacked in the NRL in Stephen Kearney, Paul Green, and Dean Pay. We've also seen the likes of Alistair Clarkson, Leon Cameron at the Giants, but even rookie coaches Heath Shaw and Matthew Nicks under a lot of pressure in the NRL as well. Roos essentially saying this is unprecedented circumstances. There's enormous pressure on head coaches as it is, let alone in these COVID times. Cut them a little bit of slack and let them get on with coaching. Do you think Roos has a fair point? Have we been too critical of coaches and even of players in this current climate?
Yeah, I really think that this has just shone the spotlight on an issue that has already plagued football for years, and all codes of football. You have a bad run of games and instantly it's the coach who falls on their sword. And a lot of times that's justified because obviously, coaches come into teams knowing that the buck stops with them. But you know, the media scrutiny and the scrutiny of fans as well is higher than ever before. And now I think with the COVID situation has just exacerbated that. So maybe it's not a new problem, but it's something that has definitely been, you know, this has really kind of exposed the pressure that coaches are under week to week, and with not much else going on, you know, I guess the focus on footy is so extreme, and you know, and you're looking for new things week in and week out to talk about, and the pressure just, you know, goes on. And with condensed seasons as well, you know, a 4-game losing run, for example, becomes, you know, a lot more serious when you're only talking about, you know, a 16-week competition, and all of those things are factoring into it. I think I'm not sure that necessarily coaches are being unfairly criticised. I think this is just, as I said, like a bit of an exacerbation of a normal, you know, situation of the scrutiny and that sort of thing. I think potentially some players are being judged harshly. I think there's been so much commentary around, you know, people having to AFL players being paid a lot of money and just having to suck it up and be, you know, sitting in quarantine bubbles. But, you know, we see things like Gary Ablett's, you know, sick son Suaalii staying home to be with his mother and his family, and I think, you know, it's important to have perspective, and that probably goes for coaches as well. You know, it's important that, you know, people remember that it doesn't really matter how much money you make, and a lot of these people actually don't make that much money, and you know, we do need to keep that in mind when we're talking about these sorts of things.
And of course, there's a massive mental health element to this as well. We know the constant pressure that coaches and players are under. I mean, even I look at Melbourne superstar Jack Viney, who has taken his 9-day-old daughter and wife into a hub environment, and just the amount of pressure that they would be under would be enormous. So I think Paul Roos's point, very, very fair indeed, and you've summarised it really well there, Beth. Our third story today, and one we're going to spend a little bit more time on, is one I'm sure you've been following closely in your role as editor of rugby.com.au. Reports coming out yesterday via the Daily Telegraph and Phil Rothfield that Joseph Suaalii, the 16-year-old superstar who was believed to have chosen rugby league and the South Sydney Rabbitohs over rugby union, is in fact going to go back the other way, with Rugby Australia, you know, reportedly offering Suaalii $3 million over 3 years to come and play in their code, potentially to go to the Olympic Games next year as part of the Australian men's rugby sevens team, and then to sign with the Waratahs with a view of being ready for the 2023 Rugby World Cup. We know that his talent is extremely hyped and relatively unprecedented, and also his size and physicality for a 16-year-old. He's essentially good to go. And in this yarn by Jamie Pandaram in the Daily Telegraph, he mentions that Suaalii trained with a professional men's rugby team at age 14 and showed up a few of the players there with his physicality. So we know this kid is an enormous talent. We know that it's a competitive marketplace, and that Rugby Australia have missed out to rugby league over the journey to some really talented players, guys like Kalen Ponga and Angus Crichton. But $3 million over 3 years is a lot of money for an organisation which has only got a $10 million broadcast deal this year, and which has seen players take some pretty big pay cuts and really have no guarantees of being reinstated to their full salaries. Pandaram's got a couple of quotes from anonymous Wallabies players suggesting that it's pretty ridiculous to offer a 16-year-old that much money when they're being forced to take pay cuts. Where do you stand on this one, Beth? Has Rugby Australia misread the room here, or should we be applauding the aggressive recruiting tactics?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that has to be established is 100% clear that rugby definitely wants this kid, and they want him really quite badly. You know, as rugby league do, he's a once in a generation type talent. You know, as you said, ready to go, and you know, potentially in Super Rugby can play at 17, which is not necessarily the case in rugby league. But the money situation is obviously, you know, there's a tipping point there, and while Rugby Australia doesn't want to have, you know, a Cam Murray, another Angus Crichton, you know, playing over in the NRL, they've got to make sure that this is a responsible decision. I think Rugby AU CEO Rob Clark came out last night and described the figures being discussed as fanciful. And I think, you know, hopefully that, you know, that is accurate. And we're not talking about a $3 million deal. We're not talking about paying a teenager $1 million a year when, you know, the captain of the Wallabies has been on an 80% pay cut, you know, for 3 months. That does not sit well. It would not sit well with players. It would not sit well with fans. And, you know, you look at a business that has had to shed a third of its workforce this year, and potentially will have to do more of that going forward. Like, it's just, there's a balance there where you've got to understand, you know, the value of what you're paying for. On the other side, you know, in 2023, if Joseph Suaalii is winning the Wallabies World Cup, is anyone going to remember that we were talking about this? Probably not. And that's the thing, is you have to decide, is it worth going out on a limb for? And, you know, if he's as good as everyone says he is, potentially. I don't think that the figures that are being reported are accurate. You know, obviously it's more than the $570,000 a year deal that South had reportedly given him, because that was, you know, part of the lure of playing rugby. But, you know, clearly $1 million a year is too much for a teenager. And I don't also think that incoming Wallabies coach Dave Rennie would be willing to kind of endorse that sort of decision, that level of cash for a teenager, when all he has spoken about coming in is about culture and about building that culture. And I don't think that the first step as Wallabies coach in building culture is to pay a teenager, you know, hundreds of $1,000s a year when the rest of your playing squad are taking pay cuts and supporting the future of the game.
It would certainly put a great deal of pressure on the young man if he were to walk into a professional environment for the first time on that sort of money. It's a risk versus reward type situation, I guess. I'm sure there's plenty more to play out in that one over the coming days. To another rugby league, rugby union cross-code superstar, one with a little bit more miles in the tank, and that's Sonny Bill Williams. And reports that with the Toronto Wolfpack, his current team, pulling out of the Super League competition in the UK this season, that they've given their blessing to Sonny Bill Williams if he wanted to chase a short-term NRL contract for the rest of 2020. Instantly linked, depending on which newspaper you read, in the 9 newspapers this morning linked to the St George Illawarra Dragons, the newspapers this morning linked to the Canterbury Bulldogs, and across the ditch linked to the New Zealand Warriors. But Paul Kent's had a look at the situation in the Daily Telegraph for the Bulldogs, weighing up whether it would be feasible for Sonny Bill Williams to come into the country. He doesn't have an Australian passport. He would likely need to quarantine first in New Zealand, then in Australia. He would need government permission to come in. We saw the Bulldogs took them a long time to organise for their young British superstar who's just arrived, Luke Thompson. Took a lot of negotiation to bring him in, and one of the ways they were able to get him in was by convincing the Australian government of the commercial benefit long term. This was a guy who'd signed a big contract and would put bums on seats. Sonny Bill looking at a short-term deal. So Kent, essentially his conclusion is this ain't going to happen. He's not going to lob at a team in Australia anyway, and maybe the Warriors are the only place it could work out for him. I mean, even then, the Warriors are based in Australia. So should we just put red line through this one and come to terms with the fact that Sonny Bill probably won't be back in the NRL?
Yeah, I can't really see a scenario where Sonny Bill plays many NRL games, if any, this season. I also just don't really know why he would have a huge desire to do that with a young family, to go through all that rigmarole. He's basically achieved everything you could want to achieve in both rugby union and rugby league. And, you know, at this point, you're chasing kind of, you know, that extra money to look after your family and that sort of thing. So I can't see a scenario where Sonny Bill is pulling on any NRL jersey this year.
Obviously speculation that he may look to fight Paul Gallen in a big boxing match at the end of the year. Do you think that one's more likely?
Yes, I think we're more likely to see him in the ring than at Leichhardt Oval.
I'm sure we will still read plenty about this over the coming days nonetheless. Our final story today that we're going to look at comes from Peter Lawler in The Australian, of course, the esteemed cricket writer. He's talked about the challenge for Cricket Australia to negotiate player availability for a rescheduled Indian Premier League competition, which is going to take place in the UAE, basically around the same time that the Sheffield Shield season in Australia will be looking to kick off. Generally, the Australian cricket calendar doesn't clash with the IPL, and that allows players to go and earn, you know, more in that couple of months than they earn in the rest of the year playing in Australia. This time around, they are likely to clash. It's a quandary for Justin Langer and Cricket Australia. I want to know, do you think it's wise for Cricket Australia to allow players to prioritise the IPL over the Sheffield Shield? I think there's roughly around 20 players with IPL contracts for the upcoming season.
Yeah, it might not be wise per se, but I think it's probably the practical thing to do, right? As you say, the earning potential in the IPL is huge, and I don't necessarily think it has a long-term, you know, impact on the quality of the test team necessarily, especially with you know, T20 World Cups coming up and that sort of thing. I think you've got to allow players to be able to maximise their earnings where you can, and that's the reality of the situation. It's not, you know, it's probably not something that a lot of fans would be able to easily stomach from an optics point of view, but at the end of the day, you know, sometimes you've just got to, you know, allow these players to be able to maximise their earnings, and you know, also India is such a powerful player in cricket, in the international cricketing world rather, and you know, they have a big say in things. So fostering that relationship as well is very important, I think.
Yeah, it's not like the Sheffield Shield's generating huge numbers of attendees or live stream viewers. And I think another interesting point to look at, and one we'll delve deeper into on another occasion, is that we saw the likes of Pat Cummins look to negotiate multi-year contracts as part of their Cricket Australia retainers for the first time this year. Traditionally, of course, the contracted list released every 12 months. It didn't happen this year, but that's certainly something that we expect to see happen in the years to come, that Cricket Australia may negotiate longer contracts with its players, and with that in mind, might then restrict their availability for the IPL. Beth, 5 big stories. You've had a great take on all of them as anticipated. Thank you so much for joining the Best On Ground Weekday Kickoff this morning.
Thanks for having me, Pete.
Look forward to having you back again soon. Remember, the show is available via Facebook, YouTube. You'll see it on Twitter, and also via Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Just search for the Best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. We'll chat to you tomorrow. Cheers.